Hello and welcome everyone to today's WorkSafe Tasmania Month webinar, Embracing Change, Uncovering and Addressing Psychosocial Risk. I'm Stephanie from WorkSafe Tasmania. Before we start, please take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. To ask any questions of our presenters today, please use the questions window on your control panel. Questions will be answered at the end of today's presentation. Today's presentation is also being recorded and will be made available on WorkSafe Tasmania's YouTube page. WorkSafe Tasmania Month is an initiative funded by the WorkCover Tasmania Board and delivered by WorkSafe Tasmania. I would now like to introduce your presenters from Altius Group, Jadine Tucker and Matthew Council. Jadine is an experienced psychologist with a background in industrial and organisational psychology. She has a passion for supporting the health and well-being of others and driving the performance of people, teams and organisations. Matthew is an experienced and highly qualified health and well-being specialist. He holds a bachelor's degree in exercise science and has 15 years of experience in the workers' compensation industry. Welcome both Jadine and Matthew.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us for WorkSafe Tasmania Month. To get us underway, I just want to give you a quick introduction to Altius Group and who we are. Altius Group is your end-to-end provider of workplace health and risk solutions. Our purpose is to help elevate the well-being for your employees, communities, and also workplaces. Who are we? We're a collection of allied health professionals, so psychologists, exercise physiologists, physios, occupational therapists, medical specialists, and you can see on the slide there under Altius Group, we're actually a collection of brands or a house of brands. So each of those individual brands you might see out in the market, but together we are Altius Group. How you may engage with us as the consumer. At the bottom of the slide there, you'll see our key service streams. So relevant to today's topic, under the People and Employee Services, we are a National Employee Assistance Program provider, or EAP provider. For those that don't know, EAP programs is an employer-funded program where you're providing access to psychologists and confidential counselling for your employees. I'm very excited to announce that we've recently employed our first psychologist in Hobart. We're a growing company, we are national, but we've just employed our first psychologist who transferred from the mainland as well. Second to that, under the workplace services, we have a team of work health safety professionals and also we support in the workers' comp space as well as an occupational rehab provider. So what this means for you, whether it's workers' comp, whether you're having issues with return to work or claims management, whether you'd like to provide support in mental health to your employees, Altius Group can be your partner. We also operate in the NDIS and we have a team of over 1,500 medical specialists on our panel to provide fitness for duty and fitness for work. We have a very broad range of services and ways that we can support your organisation. So if you have any questions or concerns or issues relating to people, health and risk, please reach out to us. I did mention that we are national. We're a team of over 800 team members and currently operating from 72 locations. Around 18 months ago, we just opened up in Hobart, and very recently, we've just commenced operations in Launceston as well. Getting down to the details for today's session, in terms of our key objectives that we'd like to cover off. Firstly, we want to enhance your understanding around psychosocial hazards in the workplace and give you an understanding of the legislation. We want to give you some tools to support your organisation in the areas of risk assessment and risk management, and also provide you with some practical steps in a worksheet to sort of guide through, once you've identified those risks, how you help control them as well. We understand that all of you may be commencing this journey at different points, but this presentation will hopefully give everyone a bit of a step depending on where you are in that spectrum as well. So whether you're here for the first time, understanding that the legislation has changed and wondering, well, how do I go about taking a psychosocial risk assessment, we'll make sure that we speak to that. And for those organisations that have already gone through their assessment, you've got your risk register, and now you're in that new world of what do we do next, Jadine will make sure she covers off some practical tips on how we can help you control those risks and hazards. With all that being said, I'm going to hand over to Jadine.
Wonderful. Thanks, Matt, and thanks so much for that kind introduction, Stephanie. So in terms of today's session, I would like to start off with just a really foundational understanding of this term psychosocial hazards and what it actually means. Now, as you've described there, Matt, I think we're going to have different people here today who have different levels of experience and understanding when it comes to this term. And from my experience in the majority of organizations, the majority of workers don't actually understand what psychosocial hazards means. Now, as a psychologist, we think about this term psychosocial as being the interplay between psychological, so what's going on in our mind, and social, which is what's going on in our world. So it's the interplay between these factors. So obviously we know when it comes to the workplace, if we're having positive interactions and experiences at work, well, then that's likely to link to a positive experience in our mind. And then obviously if we're being exposed to different environmental conditions and factors that are quite negative in nature, that could potentially risk what's going on in terms of our mental health and well-being. Now, SafeWork Australia actually define this term psychosocial hazards as anything that could potentially cause psychological harm. Now, what we're tending to find is that employers are quite intimidated by this term. Obviously, it can be quite an overwhelming concept to think, okay, well, I need to control or prevent or manage anything that could potentially cause harm. Hopefully what we discussed today is actually going to provide people some reassurance in terms of what are the things that you do need to focus your attention on, and what are the things that could be considered just standard principles or practices or conditions, within a workplace environment. Now, in terms of what could potentially contribute to psychosocial hazards, we know that this includes things such as social factors at work. So that's the interactions that you have, whether that be with fellow colleagues or with members of the public or other people involved in your work. It could be the equipment, the working environment, or the duties that you're undertaking. So that's more around the job itself. There's also factors such as the actual ways that jobs are designed, that they're organised, or how they're managed or supervised. And we also know that there's some roles where there's actually just inherent psychosocial hazards that actually come part and parcel as a part of the job there too, all right? Now, to break down these psychosocial hazards, we know that there's approximately 14 different types of psychosocial hazard categories. And employers can be quite overwhelmed when they actually see this list of different hazard categories. And one way to simplify the way that we think about this is to actually break them down in terms of people factors. So this is things like the amount of support you receive from your peers or your management, the relationships that you've got with people at work, or whether there's exposure to bullying, harassment, or whether you're working in positive working environments. There's then our job factors. So these are more job specific. So things like, what are the demands being made on workers? How much control do they have day to day when it comes to meeting these demands? Are they clear about what their responsibilities are? What's the environment like with which they're working? Are they working indoors? Are they outdoors? Do they have adequate sunlight? Things like that. Also, are they working in a remote or isolated manner, which obviously we've seen since the pandemic that is a lot more common, which can be very great from a flexible working perspective. However, there can be some potential hazards that we identify as a result of that. And those job factors also include exposure to violent or traumatic events. And something we need to be mindful of in this domain is the potential for staff to experience vicarious trauma there too. So it might not necessarily be that they're directly exposed to that violence or trauma, but also if they're working in an area of work where they could be exposed to information, material, people who have experienced those traumatic events, that's something we need to be mindful of too. And finally, we've got our system factors. So that's more thinking about the broader organisational systems and structures that are in place. Out of all of these hazards, I tend to find that people are most unfamiliar with this term organisational justice. In essence, what this is talking about is really fairness in the workplace. Do you have staff who are told one thing, but another group of staff who are told another thing, and there's no clear rationale for that? So it's really the fair application of processes, procedures, and things like that. Recognition and reward systems obviously speak for themselves. And then finally, we've got organisational change, which unfortunately, I'm yet to find an organisation that I feel is doing this really, really well. So this can be quite a common challenge that organisations face. Now, one of the most common questions that I get from organisations is, well, staff are expected to experience challenges when they're at work, and they can't be expected to just call out every single challenge as being a psychosocial factor or a hazard, all right? So what I want to do today is actually differentiate what is a reasonable expectation of staff when it comes to maybe dealing with, say, a busy period or, you know, a difficult period of adaptation to organizational change or something like that, versus something that could actually potentially cause them that psychological harm. Now, some of our people on the line today might be familiar with the job demands, job resources model. So what we know is that people, when it comes to their mental health and well-being at work, need balance between the demands being made on them and the resources that they have to meet those demands. Now, if there's an extreme imbalance with those two things, well, then we know it could actually contribute negatively to people's psychological health. And that's obviously in a dynamic where the demands being placed on them do not align with the resources that they've actually got available. Okay. Now, in an ideal world, we would love an abundance of job resources beyond, I guess, the demands being made on workers, but that doesn't quite reflect, I guess, our real working environments. So what we're really aiming for is at minimum a balance between these things. So in terms of the question, well, when does a factor, so something that could potentially cause harm, actually become a hazard? This is when those job demands are unreasonable or can't be met, or when there's not actually adequate resources that are available or provided to them, okay? Now, in terms of what the potential impacts of this are, what are the consequences? Working as a psychologist on the front lines, I've definitely been exposed to these consequences, both at an individual, a team, an organizational, and also that legislative compliance level. In terms of individuals, what we tend to see is harm in terms of both their psychological health, but sometimes also their physical health too. We know that if people are being exposed to these psychosocial hazards, things like accidents, injuries, illness can actually be a lot more prevalent. From an organizational perspective, we know it can completely derail job satisfaction, people's commitment and performance at work. We can also see things like presenteeism, absenteeism, huge amounts of staff turnover. I mean, why would a staff member want to stick around in an organization who are being asked to do things when they don't have enough resources to meet those demands? Matt, you'll talk in a second about the potential costs associated with these things. But also from a legislative compliance perspective, you know, there can be real legislative compliance ramifications as a result of this. And now that we do have this legislation in place, we're definitely going to be seeing it enforced on a more regular basis. So I will hand over to you, Matt, now, if you'd like to talk about some of the costs associated, you know, with these impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to drive home a couple of those key points, when there are psychosocial hazards, these may result in psychological injuries in the workplace. So there is a human element to these injuries. And of course, we'd never want any of our employees, our friends, our family, anyone that we know to incur an injury in the workplace. When injuries do occur in the workplace, that's when it does become a workers' compensation claim. And you can see here some statistics around the costs of psychological injuries or mental health claims. The data shows us that from a cost perspective, you're looking at compared to a physical claim, the cost of a psychological claim is around 4 to 5 times. And in terms of the duration of these claims, of people being absent from the workplace, you're looking at around 5 times longer. So that's what the data is telling us, that these injuries that occur that are related to psychosocial hazards are costing organisations more in terms of time loss and workers' comp premiums, but there is also that human element of people being disconnected from their workplace and their community for longer as well. In the top right-hand corner, you can see a couple of statistics around the main contributors to psychological injuries, and these are around anxiety and stress. 70% of all psychological injuries can be drawn back to these two factors, which we know have a biopsycho component, being part of our biology and part of our makeup, that all of us are unique and different. But there is certainly, when we look at the framework of psychosocial hazards, a huge amount of areas that an organisation can start to put controls in place to reduce these on an individual. For many organisations, you may be feeling this is a bit overwhelming and where do I start? We encourage you to start making small steps in the right direction, because this is now legislated, this is now your responsibility, and we need to be making progress to protect the organisation, but also the people within it. So we touched on the legal requirement and the fact that this is now legislated. So what are the legal responsibilities? You've all hopefully heard that safety is everybody's responsibility, and we certainly want to continue to preach that with you as well. However, legal responsibilities as an organisation, as a business, you have a legal responsibility to eliminate psychosocial risks as far as reasonably practicable. We'll talk through the hierarchy of control and highlight that elimination of these types of hazards is actually quite tricky to achieve, and we appreciate that and understand that. However, there are certainly a range of different steps that you can take to start to reduce that as far as reasonably practicable. So organisations have a legal responsibility to start looking after psychosocial hazards in the exact same way that you've always looked after physical hazards and environmental hazards as well. For any director or officer listening on the line, you personally, as part of your role, have a personal responsibility and legal responsibility to exercise due diligence to ensure the business is managing these psychosocial hazards as well. And we'll talk through a due diligence framework and what that looks like in a moment. And workers, as mentioned, it is a shared responsibility. Workers continue to have a responsibility to keep themselves safe and others safe from harm as well. When we do go down that legal pathway, if an organisation has been found as a failure to have met their responsibilities under the Act, each of these entities can all be individually and concurrently prosecuted for not meeting their legal responsibility. So as a director, you cannot sit back and say, oh, not really my responsibility, it's actually the business, or that worker did something wrong and it's actually their fault. Each individual player here, each entity can be individually prosecuted if you've failed to meet your legal responsibilities. So under the legislation, everyone has shared and equal and independent responsibility there. So in terms of due diligence, what does that look like? As an officer, it is your legal responsibility to go through this process. So you must ensure that the organisation acquires knowledge about what their legal requirements are and what risks their workforce is exposed to. Now, you can achieve that through participating in events such as today and other WorkSafe Tasmania Month events, because you are out there proactively seeking knowledge around these types of issues. Secondly, you can employ someone in the business who brings that knowledge into the business, and it's actually part of their role to go out and obtain this knowledge and advise the business on that. Thirdly, you can partner with third-party experts like Altius Group who can bring that expertise into your organisation. Second to this, you need to provide adequate resources. Sorry, you need to provide adequate resources to implement your safety system and control these risks. So that might be committing financial resources through your budgeting. It might be through providing adequate training to your team members, or ensuring that your systems are effective in controlling these risks. The third part is to actually understand what hazards are present in your workplace. So as an organisation, if you are yet to undertake a psychosocial risk assessment, this is your opportunity. Today's the day. After this presentation, start thinking about how and when you're going to go through that process. It is a legal requirement that you have assessed risks and hazards in your business, and you should be able to prove that as well. So if you're yet to do that, we will talk about the steps in undertaking a psychosocial risk assessment today. Finally, once you've acquired the knowledge, you've committed the resources, you've gone through your assessment, it's time to take action and implement process. This is an ongoing cycle, but again, hopefully you're all familiar with this concept, because this should be something that all of you should have been doing for physical risks and environmental hazards along the way. The next few slides, we've adapted some of the tools or frameworks for risk management. And again, hopefully everyone is somewhat familiar with these. And what we've done is adapt them from something that you've used or seen previously and made it relevant for psychosocial hazard assessments as well. So this here is released tools released by the regulator. And you can see here, it's a simple risk management framework. You need to identify risk, you need to be assessing them, implementing controls, and then maintaining and reviewing those. Again, that is a really simple framework, and I encourage all of you not to be put off by these buzzwords around psychosocial risks and the concerns around mental health management, psychological injuries. It may seem a little bit taboo or out of your reach. Bring it back to basics and just go through the same control processes that you've always done. If and when you get stuck, reach out to experts such as Altius Group and we can get you back on the right path. But my message is start taking small steps and implementing controls using the resources and knowledge that you already have. Around the outside of this framework, you can see that there is the highlight for ongoing consultation of your workforce. And that is the reason that we include both focus groups and survey tools throughout the psychosocial risk assessment process. One way would be top down. The leaders in the business assess the risks and say, okay, we believe these are present in the organisation. The best practice method would be to actually achieve consultation with all of your team members and allow people to provide input as to what's impacting them in the workforce as well. This next slide is the hierarchy of control, which has just again been slightly modified for the inclusion of psychosocial risks. However, what we do know from the hierarchy of control is these higher order levels, such as eliminate and redesign, are the most effective in reducing psychosocial risks in the workplace. They do, however, take a lot more commitment, likely financial resourcing and planning to achieve. If, when you reflect on how your organisation is controlling these risks, that you realise that you're only applying controls at that lower level, if you're only encouraging others and promoting others to change their behaviours, if you're putting training in place, if you're rewriting policies and procedures and you're ticking the box, these are what we call the easy wins. They're not say that they're ineffective and they don't have their place. We do encourage you, and if the easy wins are where you want to start, then absolutely start there. However, to truly do everything that is considered reasonably practicable, we do need to be challenging the organisation to think, well, how do we start to move our hierarchy of control up this ladder? Because again, the data shows us that the higher order controls are going to be more effective at reducing and eliminating your risk. Jadine will use this framework later and give some relevant examples as to, at each of these levels, what those control mechanisms look like. And finally, before I hand back over to Jadine, this is a risk matrix, which again has been extended to cater for psychosocial hazards. So people are hopefully familiar with a standard risk matrix, and on the horizontal and vertical axis, you're looking at the likelihood of something occurring and the consequence of something occurring. With this change framework, we're looking at the frequency at which someone has been exposed to these hazards and also the duration of how they're being exposed to these hazards. So the message is that these tools that you should hopefully be familiar with and you've previously applied to your workforce, with some slight tweaks and changes, we want to encourage you to use the knowledge, the tools, the resources that you're hopefully already familiar with, that you already have in your toolkit, and start applying them to psychosocial hazards. Don't be overwhelmed, don't be scared, just start taking small steps. And as I mentioned, if and when you get stuck, please reach out to Altius Group. We'd be happy to support you guys.
Thanks, Matt. I really like there that what you've really emphasized is that a lot of the knowledge that we've already got in this space when it comes to the legislative frameworks and whatnot can really be applied, in the psychosocial hazard context. So, we're not reinventing the wheel. It's really about looking at what we're already doing in the physical and environmental safety space and applying that just to a new, different group of hazards. Okay, so far what we've done is we've actually familiarized with this concept, psychosocial hazards, what it is, what it means, what are these different categories of psychosocial hazards in the workplace. And we've also looked at the legislative perspective in terms of what actually are our responsibilities when it comes to identifying, assessing, putting in place controls, and also evaluating and reviewing. So we're now going to shift towards tools for both prevention and assessment, all right? Now, in terms of how to approach conducting a psychosocial risk assessment, for many organizations, this is going to be the first time that you're actually doing this. So I wanted to share with you a few different ways that you might approach this and also some of the resources that are available to you in terms of how you embark on this journey. Now at LTS, we like to use a really robust approach when it comes to conducting a psychosocial risk assessment and obviously tailoring that towards an organisation size, what their individual needs, what their budget is, things like that. So what we recommend is firstly just starting off with a desktop and data review. So the majority of organizations will have a huge amount of really robust information when it comes to things such as staff absenteeism, turnover data, accidents and injuries, maybe compensation claims, things like that. Now, those can actually tell us a lot when it comes to what potential psychosocial hazards exist in the workplace. So that is usually where we'll start off. In terms of our assessment, we would be covering off those 14 psychosocial hazard categories, okay? So breaking it down in terms of those people, job, and systems factors that I spoke about earlier. The way that we actually collect this information could be done using a survey. So one of the benefits of a survey is you are able to collect information from a really broad group of people. And obviously it's quite quantitative data that you're collecting. Obviously, depending on the design of your survey, you could have qualitative data there too. In terms of focus groups, Matt, I absolutely love what you said there in terms of the differentiation between that top-down collection of information versus bottom-up. Often we come across organisations who from a very polite perspective, management think they know the experience of staff, yet when you actually interact with staff, from the ground up, their experience at work can be very, very different to management's perspective. So this is where that consultation is absolutely critical, and this is where the value of things such as focus groups and interviews are really emphasised. In terms of the rationale for including both focus groups and interviews, what we can find is that there's certain topics or certain types of psychosocial hazards that people might not necessarily feel psychologically safe speaking about in that group dynamic. So for example, things such as bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, things like that, especially if people are working in a culture where there's an absence of psychological safety, we really want to make sure that they actually feel comfortable sharing their experience. So that really highlights the benefits of interviews. And also in terms of surveys, if that's a confidential survey, well, then that might also get for people to share some of their real life experiences, when it comes to going to work. Now, sometimes where organizations can get lost is they do the assessment component. So they collect all of that information, yet when it comes to actually collating that information or looking at, okay, well, how can we summarize this? And what are the next steps? What are our recommendations? This is where organizations can get stuck. So we often find that organizations would then approach us as subject matter experts in this field and actually say to us, here's our data. What do we do about this? All right. Obviously, if you've got that internal expertise, well, then there is or should be enough information and resources out there to know what potential controls you could put in place. And finally, it's about translating this into a really structured, practical action plan. What are we going to do to address these hazards? Okay, what controls are we going to put in place? Whose responsibility is it for leading this? And what timeline do we actually plan to have these implemented and reviewed? All right. Now, I wanted to speak today about the People at Work survey, which is a really fabulous free-to-use tool that's available across Australia, and it is also heavily based on research, okay? So this is designed for an Australian population, so there's actually benchmarking available in terms of comparing where your organisation is at compared to other Australian organisations. What it does is it enables for you to assess a number of the most common psychosocial hazard categories that we spoke about. So those people, job and systems factors. In terms of what it enables, you can customize demographics. So for example, if you've got different work groups across your organization, you can outline that you'd like to break down your data in those domains. There is also extensive resources available for employers in all steps of the process, okay? So this includes things like your communication strategies. If you're doing focus groups or interviews, there's resources available for things like that too. There's sample reports. So there's quite a lot that's actually available in actually carrying out this process from start to finish. And there is also freely available automated surveying and reporting. Okay, so that's absolutely brilliant. It takes away the sometimes very exhaustive thematic analysis and kind of data analysis that us as organizational psychologists will be well across. So it does make it quite easy in terms of being able to release a survey that's already been designed specifically for this purpose and being able to get a report as a result of that. Now, I did just want to note a few of the restrictions of using the People at Work survey. And I just wanted to say, please don't let this put you off, but it is just something to consider. There is a time investment in actually familiarizing for the first time and using the platform, but it's something that once you've actually invested that time, it's something that you could do on an annual or even a biannual basis. So I personally did consider it a good time investment. There are limitations in how you can customize the survey. Obviously, being a validated evidence-based survey, we wouldn't want people changing questions or kind of the way that information's collected, as it could kind of risk the integrity of the survey. There are quite a large number of questions, so it is a very robust assessment, but for organisations who might have staff who are not willing or able to spend 15 minutes on a survey, well then it could be pose some restrictions there. It does have delayed identification of hazards. So what we mean there is until you've actually completed your survey and got that report, if you've got any hazards that require immediate attention, it is going to delay your ability to action that immediately. And also, it doesn't provide tailored intervention design. So there will be some resources available in terms of some recommendations that you will consider, but it won't outright provide customized recommendations to your organization like we might at LTS when it comes to providing those recommendations for an organization. Now, I will just mention there are many other tools out there, but just due to our limited time today, we did just want to outline the People at Work survey. Something that I did really want to emphasize today is some of my own personal learnings in terms of where organizations can sometimes go wrong. What we're finding for a lot of organizations is what we termed analysis paralysis, where sometimes this idea of how we're going to assess psychosocial hazards can feel so overwhelming that organizations are yet to do anything about it. Sometimes organizations might not actually consider the whole process start to finish, and they might think that it's actually a smaller venture than what it actually is. We're finding a lot of human resources, workplace health and safety personnel, or other personnel responsible for this in their organizations are trying to do it all at once and trying to do it all themselves when they actually could benefit from building a team to actually embark on this journey together. There might be crucial information that's actually missed in the setup of surveys. So really have a think about, well, what information do we want to collect, and actually accounting for that in your survey design or the way that the assessment is rolled out. Sometimes organizations can use the wrong modes to explore issues. So as I said before, thinking, okay, well, how might people share information, using this mode? Will people feel comfortable sharing information through survey, through focus groups, through interviews, and thinking about how you actually design your questions in those modes? As I mentioned before, sometimes organizations might not understand their data or actually use it in terms of identifying what controls could be put in place. They might not share the outcomes with staff in a timely manner, and that can actually create a bit of dissatisfaction from staff in terms of feeling like the organization is maybe hiding key issues or not taking action quick enough to actually address what's being identified. And finally, it's really, really important that organizations are documenting these processes, okay? So even if you've only undertaken the assessment phase, make sure that that's being adequately documented, that if for whatever reason you did get audited, you can actually demonstrate how you're meeting that due diligence, all right? So moving on, I want to go now to, well, what are some things from prevention solutions and some practical next steps that you can actually take as an organization once you've actually taken this risk assessment, all right? So as Matt mentioned earlier, I'm going to be using the hierarchy of controls framework and actually go through each of these at each level. Now, what we're finding is that organizations are very much focusing on these lower order controls, okay? So focusing more on the encouragement, the promotion, maybe the education and the administration, which in essence, that is more reactionary in terms of once someone actually becomes unwell or once we see those impacts in terms of these psychosocial hazards, instead of focusing more on the elimination, the redesign or the adjustment controls, which could really help to almost nip in the bud these psychosocial hazards in the workplace so that we don't even need these things such as education, promotion, and whatnot. So what I want to do today is really build your familiarity with these higher order controls so that you're actually aware of what you might consider if you did stumble across some of these psychosocial hazards. So let's talk about elimination. Now, I do recognize that elimination can be one of the hardest things with any type of hazard, but specifically when it comes to psychosocial hazards. The first thing that we can actually do is try and balance those job demands and job resources that I spoke about earlier. If we can do that, well, then job demands as a psychosocial hazard, which we know is one of the most common ones, that's going to help prevent the need for those lower order controls. Some ways that you might do this is you might explore things like new technology that actually reduces the demands on workers. You might consider the occupational environment and the actual exposure to physical working environment conditions that actually contribute to those psychosocial hazards. You might consider how staff engage with customers or how you're managing customers. So we do know that interactions with customers can actually be one of the strongest forms of things such as bullying, harassment, violence, aggression, abuse, and things like that. And it's also about taking behavioral action, okay? So if you do have internal staff who are actually contributing to psychosocial hazards in the workplace, making sure that you're actually addressing that early and trying to address that in a really proactive and preventative way. So once we've looked at elimination, we might then look at redesign, okay? So this is about fundamentally redesigning how work is done. So some things that you might consider in this domain is task variety. So actually trying to include variety in people's roles. You might look at job crafting. So actually empowering employees to maybe modify their work to better align with either their strengths or their interests. You might look at enhancing their skills so that they're better equipped to actually perform the requirements of their role, or trying to enrich their job so that it's more challenging or more meaningful to them. You might also consider job rotation or maybe job resourcing so that staff can actually rotate between different roles to kind of overcome any levels of boredom or stress that they might experience as a result of the types of work that they're doing. Now, obviously, each of these controls, would be relevant to different types of hazards. But what we're doing here is really just giving you a few different options, at these different levels. So moving on now, we have our next control level. Oops, sorry, I think I might have missed one there. Just playing a bit of catch up with the slides. All right, so next up we've got our adjustment, okay? So this is really about making adjustments to existing practices that you've got with your staff. Now we know that autonomy is one of the biggest drivers when it comes to job satisfaction. So where possible, give your people control, okay, in terms of how they approach their work. Some other ways you might do this is looking at flexible working arrangements. So obviously working remotely has really opened up our opportunity to enable this. So this could be something that you could consider in the adjustment domain. It's also about looking at ways that you can create a more collaborative working environment. You might look at the physical workspace of workers, so things such as promoting natural light, promoting comfort, looking at our workplace ergonomics to actually promote that well-being. And also looking at both your feedback and also your reporting mechanisms. So making sure that people, if they require adjustments, there's really easy pathways for them in terms of how they can actually create that. So our next control levels, education and administration, and our next one following, these are probably things that you're very familiar with and probably what you're already doing. So this can be things like policies and procedures, and I'm yet to see organizations really having psychosocial hazard prevention policies. So this could definitely be something that you explore. Also looking at your onboarding practices, making sure that there's actually formal processes for inducting new staff members. You might explore things like manager and leadership development programs, your internal employee training, such as things around mental health, well-being and whatnot. And also looking at the information and resources that are actually available to staff. Now, finally, we've got our encouragement and promotion. Now, it's really critical that staff are aware of where they can go or how they can go about reporting psychosocial hazards. So if you've already got established avenues for physical or environmental hazards, maybe it's about just amending those so that staff are aware that they can use those same mechanisms to report psychosocial hazards. It's also really critical that you've got an environment of psychological safety, so staff can actually feel that it's safe for them to speak up if they do encounter a hazard. We can also look at some other things such as promoting well-being, such as through employee assistance programs, potentially manager assist programs, and other well-being initiatives that are available to staff. You might explore looking at a peer support program to act as just an additional point of contact for staff to actually support their mental health and well-being at work, equipping leaders to actually act as positive role models in this space, And you might also explore some recognition, rewards, and celebration programs in place too. So I'm sure that mentally you're ticking off many of these things in your organization, which is absolutely fabulous. I give you a pat on the back for having these things in place. But my challenge for you then is to go to our other higher orders of controls and think about, okay, well, what could I potentially put in place there? All right, so I'm now going to hand over Matt, who's going to talk about some of the potential barriers that organizations commonly face and some of the ways that we might actually go about overcoming these barriers.
Thanks, Jadine. The most common questions or barriers that we encounter with our clients is around time and money. Particularly in this environment, every organisation is stretched in terms of financial resources and also in terms of personnel that they contribute to this. We understand that everyone is living these busy lives inside and outside the workplace, so where do you find time? To respond to that, think about trying to eat an elephant. My advice is to start taking little bites because if you continue to sort of look at the overwhelming task in front of you, you may be startled or paralysed and not taking action. So for an organisation, start by having a committee meeting. Start by raising it during an operational meeting, and continue to raise these issues and take small steps. There are free resources which Jadine has highlighted today that might assist you in getting underway and taking small steps. And also in terms of overcoming time, well, if your organisation is in the position, you can certainly outsource it to experts such as us. If you do feel that you're as a health and safety rep or a health and safety manager, HR manager, whoever you're representing from your organisation today, if you feel that you're not getting that support from the top down, we can provide training around due diligence to officers and directors, which is designed to run through what we have today and highlight their legal responsibilities and the ramifications or the potential impact at a personal level and to the organisation as to what may happen if they are not keeping up with the relevant legislation and requirements. So hopefully there's some of the tools or ways that you can try to overcome these common barriers that we're regularly reached out to from our clients as well. Now, in terms of the call to action, you're likely to be participating in many WorkSafe Tasmania Month events, and from each webinar or event that you're participating, you're probably walking away with one or two little gems, ideas, action items, and by the end of the day, or by the end of the month, you're likely to have a whole list of things that you need to go away and action. So for each of you, it may look different, but if I could provide a few starting points or recommendations, if as an organisation you realise you are well off the mark in terms of work health safety compliance, we can support you with what's called a work health safety gap analysis. It's very much a compliance review, an effectiveness review of your existing safety resources and systems. If that's in place and psychosocial risks, that's why you've tuned in today. If you're looking at how to take those next steps, the next couple of slides, I've got some worksheets as to how you can tackle a psychosocial risk assessment. If, as an organisation, you've got issues in workers' comp, issues with return to work, workplace culture around these types of things, Altius Group would love to be your preferred provider to support your return to work claims as well. And if you have an EAP program in place and would like a refresh look, or if you don't want to have one in place yet and would like to support the mental health of your employees, we can be your partner as an EAP program provider as well. So those worksheets, which I'll get onto now, each organisation or each of you are going to be at a different stage in your journey with tackling psychosocial risk management. For those that are very much at the front end and trying to understand, well, how do I take those next steps? This worksheet, which we will release after this session, is focused on that due diligence framework that I showed earlier. It's questioning yourself and the organisation, how are you going to acquire the knowledge? what resources are going to be provided by the organisation, how are you going to undertake your risk assessment, whether it's free tools or engaging Altius Group, and then making sure that you implement process and change. If you're very much at the front end of that process, this is a framework for you to work through, and you can use this as a meeting agenda to start to have those conversations internally. If, like many organisations at the moment, you've really undertaken that risk assessment, you're well on your way, you're trying to work out how to take those next steps, this worksheet is then therefore for you if you've got to the point of having your key psychosocial hazards documented in your risk register, but not understanding what actions you need to take to start implementing effective controls. This worksheet is based around the hierarchy of control, and for each hazard that you've now identified in the organisation, you could set up subgroups, you could sit around as a committee, you can whiteboard these ideas. Use this worksheet for each hazard that you've identified and start a conversation at each level of control and keep challenging the group to raise that bar. How do we keep shifting our focus up that scale? Because as Jadine mentioned, if we can start to nip the bud, so to speak, in terms of these psychosocial hazards, that will have a positive flow-on effect to the organisation, not only around individual health and well-being, but at an organisational level when we think about workers' comp premiums and operational disruption as well. The slide deck from today won't be released. However, we will release a condensed version of the content, and we'll include those worksheets for you and resources for you as well. Thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you, Stephanie, for having us. We'll throw over to questions in a moment. But finally, please follow Altius Group on LinkedIn, and you can connect with Jadine and myself as well. I am personally down in Tasmania every couple of months, going out, speaking to our clients and working with organisations. So if you'd like to continue the conversation, please reach out. And when I'm next down, I'd be happy to have a cup of coffee with you.
Thank you very much, Matthew and Jadine, for your presentation today. And as Matthew said, the worksheets will be made available to you, but not the PowerPoint itself, but the webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the WorkSafe Tasmania YouTube page at the end of WorkSafe Month. So we'll now go to any questions that have come through, but there's also time for you to use your questions window on the control panel to type any questions that you do have for Jadine or Matthew. So just to start, just a couple of comments that came through Jadine and Matthew. I can see this creating a massive change in how organisations manage risks. An employee can submit a workers' comp claim, which our insurance pays up to $5 grand costs whilst waiting for a claim to be assessed. Number two, small to medium-sized businesses are not resourced to manage what will now need to be specialised skills to manage.
Yes.
Second comment.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, it is a very challenging position and time for employers. However, the regulations are out, the legislation is in effect, and this is something that organisations need to step up to the plate. What isn't clear for organisations yet is, well, what is going to be deemed and considered reasonably practicable, and we're certainly waiting for the case law to start coming out around Australia from different prosecutions. So keep an eye on the news, to keep in front of that, just make sure that you're aware of what prosecutions are occurring, because that will almost set the bar, set the standard for organisations as to what is considered reasonable.
Thanks, Matthew. The psychosocial legislation also states that a person may have a predisposition to mental health, which may be exacerbated by what may be real or perceived workplace conditions. You may want to comment on that comment as well.
Yeah, I mean, we are all human, we are all unique and have our strengths and I don't want to use the word weaknesses when we talk about mental health, but absolutely, we're all genetically different. And there is greater awareness, appreciation, and acceptance in the workplace around mental health, and the fact that someone may have a predisposition to mental health disorders or symptoms may make them more susceptible to psychosocial hazards. As an organisation, you have a legal responsibility to keep people safe from hazards. So at an organisational level, you really do need to be going through that risk assessment process to try and identify what triggers are present in your workforce, and continuously consult with your workforce around how do we make things safer, how do we make things better. I dare say that you are never going to you're never going to prevent every single injury from occurring. However, as an organisation and as a community, if we keep challenging the status quo and keep taking steps in the right direction, we are going to create safer workplaces, and that is going to, at the end of the day, improve people's well-being.
Something that I just wanted to add, Matt, which I think is something that organisations can kind of look over when it comes to the legislation, is that the legislation also outlines employees' individual responsibilities when it comes to managing their own psychosocial health at work. So I think that one thing that can be truly emphasised as a result of this legislation is the responsibilities of employees to actually be fit to work from a psychosocial health perspective. So as you said, we are all different and we bring different components of ourselves to work, but there are expectations and requirements on employees that they will access the information, the resources, and that they'll also escalate any psychosocial hazards that might be of concern too.
Thank you, Jadine. A bullying harassment claim will also be a psychosocial claim. Can an employee make a workers' comp claim for both? Can it also be a fair work issue?
Yes, absolutely. When we think about psychosocial hazards and psychological injuries and workers' comp injuries, we need to separate as an organisation what pathway you're looking at responding. So if someone is injured in the workplace as a result of a hazard, then that is a workers' comp claim. Doesn't matter whether it's physical or psychological or psychosocial that has led to that injury. Then on the other side of things, we are looking at the legal requirement for organisations to keep people safe. And if they are not meeting their legal obligations in reducing hazards, that's when they may be deemed negligent or not meeting their obligations there. And of course, you have industrial relation issues as well on top of that, which can go through to fair work. So absolutely, yes, there's the legal pathway where organisations can be prosecuted for not meeting their legal responsibilities under the legislation and the Act. There is a workers' comp component to this as well, and absolutely it can stand alone as a fair work issue and concurrently.
Thank you, Matthew. With many industries experiencing workforce issues, how do you manage a psychosocial hazard if we also know that an organisation may be short-staffed?
It's tricky and there's no silver bullet to this response, particularly when Jadine talks about the main categories of psychosocial hazards, and one of them is adequate resourcing. It comes back to what is considered reasonably practicable for an organisation. Of course, every organisation would love to have more resources and personnel in place. If there was an incident and there was a claim reported and if it was investigated, I guess that's what the regulator would be trying to assess. Has this organisation done everything considered reasonably practicable? Have they got a risk management process in place? Have they considered resourcing? And does that align to what's realistic in the workplace? Now, if that injury still occurs as a result of that hazard, there's two things. One, that person has incurred an injury in the workplace. So either way, it is still a workers' comp injury. But whether or not that employer is deemed negligent or whether they have failed to meet their legal obligations is a different conversation. So yes, someone still can be injured And yes, the employer can still be compliant with their obligations as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Matt. And I was just going to jump in to say, I mean, this is definitely not a circumstance that I've never come across before. You know, it can be very common for organizations to struggle from a resourcing perspective. I'd encourage anyone listening who might be in that situation already, try get creative with your resources. Shift outside of that box of thinking of, well, we just need to hire more people, and think about, well, what else can we do to support our people in this domain that doesn't involve hiring more people? Is it about a recognition and reward program? Is it about looking at how you can automate the actual work that they're doing? Is it about having clarity around, well, what are the key priorities that they need to get done in a day, and giving them clarity about what actually gets dropped at the end of the day when they're out of time being at work? So I think there's many other things that organizations could explore, but it's about just having the time and the patience, and as I said, sometimes the creativity to do that.
Thank you. Can you describe level of consequence which you mentioned in your risk matrix?
Yep. Sorry. I'll just have to go back to the slide. I'm not quite sure I understand the question, to be honest, in
Yeah,
terms of the risk matrix.
I'm not sure if we're talking about the slide on the risk matrix, or whether we're talking about, we had another slide which is kind of on the potential consequences.
Perhaps Stephanie, if that person can just provide a bit more clarity to the question, we'd be happy to respond after the session, because it sounds like it might be getting into the details of that slide a little bit more.
Yep.
No, that's fine. As Matthew just mentioned, if that individual can shoot me an email at the end of the session, that would be fantastic. Maybe some further details that may have come through. Risk matrices are calculated from likelihood and consequence. So how do you measure the level of harm?
Yeah, so we looked at modifying that tool to look at weighing up the frequency of exposure to psychosocial hazards, and also the duration that someone was exposed to that hazard. So not necessarily looking at the level of harm, so to speak, but trying to use the existing frameworks as to, well, what would be considered in terms of a low level exposure to psychosocial, to someone being constantly and regularly and repetitively exposed to psychosocial hazards. The reason that is we understand that the more frequent and continuous that someone is exposed to a stimulus, a hazard, is likely to increase the outcome being a psychological injury.
All right, thank you, Matthew. And then just to conclude, does Altius Group offer grief counselling?
Absolutely. Jadine, did you want to speak to our People Sense offerings?
Definitely. So look, we're consulted for a variety of situations of grief. So it's not only providing grief counselling, whether that be through our EAP or our private health services, but we're also commonly engaged if you've got a staff member who's potentially experiencing a terminal illness. We can provide consultancy and support for both the organisation and the people who work alongside that person. But then also after a bereavement, if it happens unexpectedly, we provide critical incident services to go on site and be available for staff, and also supporting the team following and helping them kind of recreate team alignment after a situation like that. So sorry, that was an absolute mouthful, but we do a huge amount in that space.
No, thank you very much, Jadine. So that brings us to the end of today's presentation, and I also wanted to make comment about the People at Work survey that you mentioned in your presentation. If anyone would like further information as well about the People at Work survey, we do have further details on the WorkSafe Tasmania website, so do head there as well to find out more. But thank you very much to Altius Group, to Matthew Council and to Jadine Tucker for their webinar today, which has been run as part of WorkSafe Tasmania Month. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the WorkSafe Tasmania YouTube page at the end of October. And if you would like to go to any other webinars that we are running throughout the month of October, or in Tasmania we are running in-person events, please head to the WorkSafe website, have a look at the WorkSafe Tasmania Month program, and see what else is happening in your area. But on behalf of the WorkCover Tasmania board, who fund the WorkSafe Tasmania initiative and WorkSafe Tasmania, thank you to Jadine and Matthew, and thank you to everyone for attending.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks,
Thank
everyone. Have a great
you.
day.
See ya.